Okay, well, it's 1 o'clock. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. Um, I'm Carolyn Merrick, Program Coordinator here at the center. And just a couple of pieces of business. If you would be so kind as to mute yourself if you're not already muted, and if you're not the presenter. That way, that'll cut down on background noise. Katherine Seluja, my good friend, is going to be presenting, and we'll have this recorded. So we want to make sure the recording's as clear as it can possibly be. But if you have any questions after Katherine presents her information, feel free to unmute yourself to ask your questions. Not a problem. Okay. So I want to introduce Katherine to you. As you may have read, if you've signed up for this, she's a poet and a nurse practitioner. And again, a very good friend of mine. She's the author of Gather the Night. It's a poetry collection that focuses on the impact of mental illness and is dedicated to her brother. It's a very moving book. She's also co-author with Tina Carlson and Stella Reed of the collaborative poetry collection, We Are Meant to Carry Water. And I'm proud to say that it is an award-winning book. It just won the New Mexico, Arizona Book Award. Her poems have appeared in American Journal of Nursing, uh, the Fourth River Intima, Santa Fe Literary Review, and Sin Fronteras, among others. Katherine works in ambulatory pediatrics in Espanola. I can't even say it. I've been out in New Mexico for so long.
Española.
Espanola Hospital as an adjunct clinical faculty for the University of New Mexico College of Nursing. So I'm happy to present to you Katherine Seluja.
Thank
All
you, Carolyn.
right. Sure.
Thank you so much for inviting me here today. And thank you for all of you for jumping on the bandwagon here. It's great to see you all. So I am today going to be sharing with you a few of my family stories and also a few poems that have been inspired by those stories. I'm right now working on a newer group of poetry that is being very much informed by immigration and migrants. And because all of my grandparents on both sides of my family were immigrants from Italy, it just naturally led me to want to write down a number of our family stories, but in poetry form. So I'm going to be talking and reading poems a little bit back and forth. Probably, I think I'll be reading 5 or 6 poems. And then that should leave us some time just for discussion or questions or whatever you guys would like. But I'm going to just go ahead and open with my first poem, just so you guys can hear my poetic voice and what I like to consider welcoming in the poetry gods. This short poem is something of an ode to spaghetti sauce. And if any of you are Italian or know Italians well, you know it's easy for an Italian to go on about spaghetti sauce. And it's called Your Grandmother's Bolognese. Don't begin if you're angry. A relaxed jaw is needed to mince. Ask for an ancestral blessing. Touch knife blade to worn wedding stone. Your tears will moisten the onions. Add a little less salt. Stir deep into the pot, or something will surely get singed. Fold in tomatoes once. Skin moist red glistens. Remember the sugar for St. Gertrude. If your grandfather appears, use oregano. It will always taste better on Thursdays. Add a T-bone if you wait until Sunday. It should smell like the moment you stepped into her house. In her village, spruti means beginning to thicken. And that line about smelling like the moment you stepped into her house is something that I actually use when I'm cooking a recipe of my mom's or my grandma's. Occasionally I'll like step outside in the yard, and when I step back in, if I feel as if I'm stepping into their house, I know I'm on the right track. So I don't know if any of you have had that experience cooking as well. So I'm going to move over to sharing with you a little bit about my family, my ancestors, really. As I mentioned, all of my grandparents on my maternal and paternal side, they all were born in Italy and immigrated from Italy in that early 1900s wave of immigration. My mother's family was all from northern Italy in the Lake Country, and my father's family all the way from Sicily. So they had that opposites attract thing going on, I guess, when they met. But the story that I'm very intrigued with goes back another generation to my great-grandma, my maternal great-grandmother, Enriqueta Cavignolo, so my grandmother's mother. And Enriqueta lived in the lake regions near Lago Maggiore in northern Italy. And when she was about 18, her parents were arranging her future and arranged her marriage. And she became betrothed. And I don't know, unfortunately, I don't know details about who she was betrothed to, but what I do know is she wasn't so happy about it. So somehow, after all the arrangements were made, Enriqueta managed to convince her father to allow her to sail across the Atlantic and spend a summer in New York, where they had friends and a bit of extended family, to spend that summer just for a little break, I suppose, before she would return and be married. And if I'm sure you can all imagine, in something like the late 1890s, that was a pretty extraordinary thing at all that her father agreed to it. But that's what Enriqueta did. And while she was in New York, she would go out walking, probably in Central Park. That's what I imagine, walking in the afternoon. And one day she happened to find herself in the neighborhood of a very then and still now very famous restaurant called Delmonico's. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of it. It was at that time famous for its Italian food, but also American specials on the menu as well. And the timing just happened to be that they had lost some kitchen staff. And Enriqueta, who I understand was a very bold and courageous woman, and I'm told I take after her in some ways, which I like, went into the restaurant during the day and introduced herself to the head chef and basically said, you know, you need me or give me a chance. And remarkably, somehow he did. Again, for a woman to be working in a restaurant kitchen at all at that time is, you know, was pretty unusual. And so she started out working more just as kitchen help or kitchen assistant, but eventually she moved up to becoming sous chef, or the sauce chef and assistant chef, making soups and sauces and desserts as well. So that part of the story inspired this poem. I am told their marriage was arranged. Her father agreed to the voyage to appease the daughter whose future was settled. The seas rough that spring, she spent most of her time below deck. A clear broth and the finest hand-rolled orbs of meat. Pasquale delivered the eggs every morning. She had moved on to pastry by then. Relaxed fingers and loose wrist make an excellent whisk. Her red hands difficult to hide at dinner. Kidney beans soaked in caldo, secret of her grandmother's soup. The maitre d' placed a placard in the window. She never dreamed a woman would be considered. Her ossobuco caught the chef's attention. Her aunt noticed the chafed hands, but kept her questions to herself. Late summer, letters arrived. Figlia, quando torni? Enriqueta inquired discreetly about the young man who delivered the eggs. So the young man who delivered the eggs and chickens to the back door of the kitchen every day was Pasquale Cavignolo, who would become my great-grandfather. So the plan changed a little bit with Enriqueta and her betrothal. They started talking and discovered that they were actually from the same area of Italy, from northern Italy, and just completely things just took off between them. In that last poem I read to you, there's a line in Italian towards the end about her parents' letters saying "Figlia quando torni," which in Italian means, daughter, when are you coming home? When are you returning? And this is a little bit of the poet's imagination at play, I would say, but I imagine that that would have had to have happened because Enriqueta kept delaying her return. And her family and her betrothed were wondering, what the heck's going on here? She was, supposed to come home after the summer and be married. So the story goes, eventually, her betrothed wrote her, decided, okay, I'm going to take things into my own hands. He wrote her a letter and let her know that he'd be sailing to New York, supposedly to pick her up, claim her, and bring her home. But things didn't go exactly as he had planned. I don't exactly know what her betrothed's name was. So in this next poem I'm going to read you, I decided to name him Cesare. So this is somewhat of a companion poem to the other poem that I just read. And it's called, I Am Told Her Parents Knew Nothing of the Plan. They saved for months, ever since Cesare's letter announcing his springtime arrival. By then, she had relinquished her old life. She was sure she saw the neighbors' curtains move each evening as Pasquale walked her to her door. Her aunt's raised eyebrows. The kitchen was her new world. She developed a series of dipping sauces, parsley, garlic oil, poached truffles, each named for a different family member. They arrived early at Pier 46, watched the ship's slow approach to the dock. The evening loaves waited by the oven. How to explain to her betrothed his wasted weeks at sea? She had a plan, and the old world had no part. Cesare swayed down the ramp, spotted her waving Pasquale's hand at her elbow. His accent caught her off guard. Her pet name, Piccolina. His outdated Piemonte country clothes. Enriqueta and Pasquale passed Cesare an envelope filled with their savings. When had her old life ended? He looked down and spit at their feet. Later, she heard he had booked passage on the next ship home. So that last piece is the story I was told, that Enriqueta had no intention of going home with her betrothed, and she and Pasquale made a plan and saved up as much as they possibly could and met the betrothed at the pier with a packet of money. And their intention was to, kind of to pay him off, I guess you could say, but also they really wanted to give him an opportunity if he wanted to stay in the new world in New York and maybe start a new life there, a business, a new life. But what I understand happened is he took the money and got back on a ship back to Italy. And I always remember my aunt, who's also my godmother, my mother's sister, she'd always shake her head when she'd be telling us that part of the story, because she thought that was a wasted opportunity in a sense. Here is a photo I happen to have of, I'm going to see if I think you can see that. That's Enriqueta and Pasquale in their later years. Can you see it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. So there they are. That's when they're actually back in Italy again, in front of a fig tree. And there's one more. I don't know if that one you can see as well. That's her. I think you can see she looks
like you.
Oh yeah, really? Oh, Thanks, pal. Well, that's okay. I was going to say she looks strong to me. I don't know. That's like there's a strong jawline or something going on there. So that's Enriqueta. Okay. So now I'm going to move us over a little bit to the other side of my family, my father's side, my paternal side. And I have a couple of poems about my Sicilian grandfather. Carolyn, maybe you can bring up that picture of the artichoke. This is a photo of stuffed artichokes. I'm wondering if any of you have ever had these or seen them in your travels. I see someone nodding their head. I can't see all of you right now. I see a few of you. But this item takes a very cherished and lofty place in my household and in my childhood. And this is a recipe that my Sicilian grandpa brought with him from his mother. And he was the cook in his house here in America. And he made this recipe often. It's something particular we often would have in the springtime, like around for Easter and around that time. But this, as far back as I can remember, stuffed Sicilian artichokes were and still are one of my absolute favorite foods. So I was a little kid, like growing up in northern New Jersey, and when the teacher would say, you know, what's your favorite food, right? And kids would say hot dogs, pizza, hamburgers, and I'd be like that one going stuffed artichokes, and everyone would look at me like, what are you talking about? But this was it. So it's a absolutely yummy to me combination of breadcrumbs, fresh chopped parsley, fresh garlic, and grated Parmigiano Romano cheese, all mixed together. And you kind of slowly and laboriously with a little teaspoon stuff every one of those leaves. And then they're steamed in a pot for about an hour or so. And they are just delish. And if anyone's interested, I'm more than happy to share that recipe, or if that's something you'd be interested in trying or venturing out, I can send our family recipe to Carolyn and she could forward it to you. But because this meal, just I can't express it enough, what a high place in our household it took. It's inspired actually, someone saying me too. Okay, Judy, yes. It inspired several poems. So this next one I'm going to read to you is entitled Carciofo, which is the Italian word for artichoke. And the he in the poem is my Sicilian grandpa. Carciofo. He carried it, a most precious thing, in the aluminum Dutch oven before him. His hands protected by insulated mitts, he carried it like the gift it was. As the Dutch had carried it to King Henry's court, and the French to Louisiana much later. This spiky, unreachable, this inflorescent cousin of thistle, the plant that grew wild in the fields and sandy soil in the Sicilian hill town where he was born. He was 14 when his father sent him west across the Atlantic into the hands of friends of friends. Strani, his mother complained as she wrapped a small loaf of bread and a rind of cheese into a linen cloth. His father sent him in search of something more, to this place across the sea, and he would find that more, make it better still. With a handshake and a paper bag of paper money, he would buy land and profit, build a few shops, grow the new world, a wife and a son, and his son would too. Until this night, when my grandfather walks the few suburban steps to our home. Past the leaning willow Mr. Hickey refuses to cut down. Past Mrs. Shearer's yard filled with English roses. He steps carefully over the uneven square of cement pushed forth by the unruly roots of sycamore. The glowing silver pot filled with the manna of his childhood. A precious thing made more so by its inner secret, its soft and delicate heart protected by a wreath of spiny thorns, sharp enough to draw blood from the thumb of a careless cook. The layered green leaves filled with garlic and breadcrumbs, just as his mother had shown him, despite his father yelling from the yard, "Ho bisogno di quel ragazzo qui," demanding the boy come now. Green with parsley and overflowing with grated Romano. Roman steps, like his steps, here now, along this New Jersey street, carrying the steaming pot to our front door. Now you're getting the food of poetry title, right? Or the poetry of food. I guess I switched it, but it works both ways to me. I realize poetry is a kind of food for me, and I think for many of us. So I mentioned in that poem, and if those of you who are familiar with these artichokes, you might know that there are many, many leaves, and as the leaves get closer and closer to the middle, they get smaller and spinier and thornier. And way down in the middle of the artichoke is the heart, like artichoke hearts. The method or procedure for cleaning that, there's all these tiny, tiny little spines, or the choke part, that kind of nestle in right above the heart. And there was a very, very specific method that, at least that my family had, for how to clean all those spines off. And when we were young, my grandpa or my mother would do it for us. But at some point, it was sort of a coming of age, a passing of the knowledge in a sense. And when we were deemed old enough to be able to handle the knife without cutting ourselves and to manage it, we were taught very precisely how to do this cleaning so we could get to the inner steamed heart. And if you've never had that before, then it's totally worth making this, even if you just make it for that, because a fresh steamed artichoke heart is nothing at all like, what we think of as the pickled or vinegar kind of jarred or canned artichoke hearts. It's totally different and very delicious. So one more poem, a sort of companion poem to that one, came forward about that process. And that's called My Grandfather Teaches Me How to Flay the Heart. It was considered ritual in our family, the cleaning of the spiny thistle, a passing of tradition and knowledge, the confidence that one could handle the blade as well as the spine. Caterina, my grandfather, calls questo è come è fatto. This is how it's done. And with thorny heart in one hand and blade in the other, he teases apart the layers, each leaf nested tight within the next. The spiny thorns grow sharper with progression toward the heart. He left his heart in the sandy soil of his Sicilian hill town home, the day he boarded the ship that would take him west across the sea. Sitting at his kitchen table, he passes me the layered heart with strong warning, never leave a single thorn in place. A teasing out, a gentle splay. My grandfather's hand on mine, his shoulder solid for me to lean on. A stone wall built around a small village. Okay, Carolyn, I think we can bring down the artichokes. And this is going to move me to the last poem I'm going to share with you. I showed you the few photos of my great-grandparents, and those, along with many others, I was really, I feel blessed actually, and fortunate enough to have received from my aunt, my mother's sister, who's also my godmother. She had a shoebox, frankly, full of them, stuffed full, that she probably got from her mother. And at some point, when my aunt was already older, I went to visit her, and we were just looking at different things she had in the house. And this shoebox was up on a shelf in the garage, of all places. But she took it down and invited me to just pull out as many photos as I wanted. There was more than enough to share with all the cousins and myself. So I feel really lucky to have that. And in there is another image that I'm hoping you guys can see also. It's kind of faded, but I think you can probably see that. And that's remarkably to me an image of Enriqueta's mother, Josefina, on something. It's not quite a, what's that called? The daguerreotype, not quite, but it's close to that, the process of that imprinted image. So this is my great-great-grandmother. And that to me is just incredible and stunning. I'm sure many of you know that feeling when you have recorded image and record of your ancestors and your roots. So they are all together. They live all together in one same area of my desk drawer. But within the shoebox full of photos that my auntie had, there were also many, many prayer cards or funeral or mass cards, kind of like this one. You can see that.
Yes.
These are probably familiar to you guys. I'm just showing you what all we had. Many, many, as you are probably, many of you are familiar with, they just get kind of stuck into Bibles or into books or in with other photos. So there were many of these, some of them names that I recognized, you know, like siblings of my grandparents, and many of them that I didn't recognize, but I knew were somehow extended family or friends. And they bring me a lot of comfort. I have them just all together in one spot. And sometimes I just look through and kind of talk to them a little bit in my head, I guess. So all of these images inspired this last poem that I'm going to read to you. And that's called In the Drawer of My Grandmother's Writing Desk, the Dead Rest. Smelling faintly of lavender and garlic, they appear in the shape of a stack of small cards, softened from age and handling. Cream colored with gray lettering and images of aunts and uncles I never knew, with names like Uno, Antonio, Regina Felice. The slightest smile on their faces, or no smile at all, but a reflection of light in their eyes. In this way, I came to know those who had come before. I begin to understand my place in the line of the daughter of this daughter's son. Some who had traveled across the sea, others who had stayed behind. Back when the onion skin envelope with the red and blue edging seemed so exotic, and yet usually heralded sad news. When the crackling voice of the overseas operator meant only one thing, another loss. Another cream-colored card to add to the pile. Because wouldn't the ancestors find comfort together at that large oak table standing somewhere in a field? Cavetiere and steaming bowls of marinara, sliced tomatoes and mozzarella. The uncles sharing a few cigars, the aunts morsels of gossip. Don't they laugh? Aren't they amused as they watch us scurry to place flowers at their graves, honor their saint days, light candles, sending up words and wishes, waiting for some small sign. Tap on the shoulder, knock at the door, bowl of ziti knocked to the floor. How they love to play with us. And that's my story. That's what I have to share with you guys today. I don't know if there's questions or comments, or I don't know how you want to move next, Carolyn, if there's any discussion.
Yes, well, I honestly, I'm having a hard time keeping it together. I was very moved by your poems. But I do want to say before I forget that there are several of us, including myself, who would love your stuffed artichoke recipe. So,
Okay, great.
so please, please. And I see some people have unmuted themselves. So go ahead and ask or chat or discuss. That'd be great. It's a great time to do that.
Oh,
Thank
okay,
you.
there it is.
So go ahead.
Yes, well, my father, his parents, also came from Sicily in the early 1900s, but my mother's parents came from Slovakia.
Oh, okay.
And my mother was determined as a young bride to learn to make the sauce for my father, and she learned from my grandmother. And she told the story about how she kept saying, asking him, how is the sauce? Is it good? Is it good? And yes. And finally she said, but is it as good as your mother's? Finally he said, it's better than your mother's.
Wow.
And
All
my mother, my Slavic mother was known for her Sicilian spaghetti sauce. My cousins from downstairs who were also Slavic, every Sunday came up, and every Sunday just about we made the sauce, and my job was to fry the meatballs, to get them browned and put them in the pot.
Mm-hmm.
And nothing was ever written down. And I have made my mother's sauce. I cannot duplicate the meatballs. I just remember everything she put in, all the ingredients. They never come out exactly like hers. But one thing that my grandmother used to say was that it was meat. You had to have a lot of meat in the sauce. And we had spare ribs and,
wow.
and sausage and the meatballs.
Yeah.
And my mother became famous for her Italian spaghetti sauce. So it was kind of a funny story. I was wondering where in North Jersey you're from.
I grew up in Bergen County and Teaneck.
So did I. I'm from Garfield.
Oh, okay. Oh, wow. Sure. Really, we were practically neighbors. Yeah.
Practically, yes.
Yep. Really, ended up there being the same thing because that's where some of the family was, and then when I was about 25, I left New Jersey and came further west to New Mexico.
And
but
I went
for
south.
years, right. For years, my mom would say, figlia quando torni, basically, daughter, when you coming home, like a good Italian mom.
Yeah.
And I would tease her and tell her, it's your parents' fault, your father's fault, because they came west, the way I look at it, to the US, and I just kept taking the journey more west. But
well, when I would go visit them, I would go to the store that they always went to and buy Italian bread. Several loaves. I'd go early in the morning when they were still warm before I left, and bring for all my friends the cheese, the Bolognese cheese.
Right, exactly. Yep.
And all my friends, I would bring them cheese. So it was, because you couldn't get the good hard rolls, the good Italian bread. I was in Washington, D.C. at the time. And so it was quite a venture.
You're making me hungry, Judy. I'm 2 hours behind you. I'm getting close to lunchtime.
Pardon, I didn't hear that. I didn't hear that.
I said, you're making me hungry because
I
I'm
know
getting close
those
to
artichokes, didn't you?
April and Jean and Tom, I see you all are unmuted. Does somebody want to share? Go ahead, April.
Okay, thank you, Catherine, for sharing everything. I envy you and your history, and you have so much that I don't have, and it's just a real awareness that I don't have it. And I was wondering, have you been back to Italy to visit and find other relatives that you connect with? And also about your poetry, I was just wondering, have you always been a poet? Have you always liked to write? Or is this something that's come upon you later in life?
Yeah.
Those are questions.
Thank you. Thanks. I'm going to answer the second one first.
Okay.
I always loved to write, but I was a musician first. As a young person, I studied classical piano for about 15 years.
Bye.
And I actually thought that was what I was going to pursue. And then I took a turn into healthcare, which happens. There's a lot of science musical people, but I took a turn into healthcare. And honestly, for years, while I was working and raising my family, I didn't write in any active way.
Mhm.
But about 12 or 13 years ago, I picked it up again and have moved into, you know, this more current phase of poetry and also a little bit of flash fiction. My friend Len, who's listening in, is one of my flash fiction buddies right there. So that's, and poetry is what I realized it, for me, it made a connection for me to that early musical training. The rhythm, you know, the auditory experience of poetry,
Sure. Mhm.
very important to me, and the kind of rhythm and pacing. And so it's been fascinating for me to see how in a lot of ways that early musical training, I think, kind of got me ready to do this. So that's been kind of cool to see.
Yeah, very cool.
In terms of your first question, yes, I've been back to Italy. I've been back twice. I want to be back many, many more times. It's when I want to really just be anywhere, that's where I want to be.
Mhm.
But I've been to the north and in not the exact village where my grandma and great grandma came from, but very, very close, and right on Lago Maggiore on the lake. And
I was
oh, sorry, Judy,
Oh.
go ahead.
it's just that I was planning to go there this past spring, and obviously
Wow.
couldn't go.
I know how many trips, my husband and I as well, that this was going to be the year. I've gone with other family members, but we haven't gone together yet. And this was going to be the year. So
Yep.
hopefully next year or the year
Maybe
after.
next
but
year or the year
yeah.
after.
Yeah. So, and it was amazing for me to finally get particularly to Lago Maggiore, because my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, who I was probably the closest to, told me stories on a regular basis about that area. So when I finally got there and really, you know, had my feet on the ground and walked the area, it was very powerful, as you can imagine, a true, you know,
Sure.
connection to the roots for me. Yeah.
I'm sure it was, for sure. And so most of your stories then, did they come to you verbally from your relatives, or was it written down somewheres, or how did you get all of this information that you have?
Yeah, many of the stories were told to us verbally by my mom, my auntie, my grandma. But I'm also really lucky. My mother wrote down a cookbook, because Judy, I think you mentioned about not having the recipe written down, because it's true, all the old time cooks, you know, they cooked like this, right? A handful, a pinch, whatever. But my mom pursued it, and she wrote down really as a labor of love, frankly, for us. It's a cookbook that she dedicated to myself and my 3 siblings. She wrote down all of her mother's and her grandmother's and my father's mother's recipes. So, and she interspersed a number of these stories, like the whole story about Enriqueta and her betrothed, she wrote down within, in between the recipes. Yeah, so that's my primary source. And then, you know, what's it called? The artistic license, right? A little bit of
Absolutely.
imagination for the details I don't exactly know, and that's okay in poetry land. So
yeah. Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, April.
Jean and Tom, one of you?
I was going to ask almost the same questions that April did, and so you've covered a lot of them. But I just want to compliment you on your voice. the way I could almost make myself think I was in Italy when you were and going out to the garden or whatever. It was very lovely, and your choice of words helped to do that. That's what I was amazed about, that you could find all those words and descriptions when you weren't the person who had been there. So thank you very much. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you, Jean. I want to thank you for your background because I haven't seen the Northern Lights in person yet, but I'm pretending like I'm seeing them right now. So thanks. We're in like Minnesota or Alaska or something.
Right. Well, you can thank Zoom for it. It's a canned background, so.
I love it.
Well, thank you. Just your poems are so inspiring. I hope you will consider publishing a book. I can envision a book with recipes, the poems, and even if you would share photos of your family, I think that would just be, I would certainly buy it. One of the most interesting things to me, I absolutely love hearing you speak Italian. And I wonder if you could tell us, was it spoken in your family a lot? And is that where you learned to become so fluent in Italian and to be able to pronounce the words so well? I just wonder if you could tell us about that, because I mean, I could just sit for hours and listen to you speak in Italian. It's just so wonderful and so moving.
Well, Tom, I pulled it off on you. I am by no means fluent in Italian, by no means. Yes, it was spoken often and frequently in my household, and I have what I call it is I have it in my ear. So I can picture little 4, 5, 6-year-old me playing on the living room floor on a Sunday afternoon and all the extended relatives there and speaking Italian constantly. So it's in my ear. But back then, in the 60s, which I hate to admit to you, but I can admit to you, in the 60s, remember there was kind of that feeling amongst a lot of first generation immigrants, let's speak English, right? That kind of mentality. And so unfortunately, although my parents spoke Italian between themselves a little bit, they didn't speak it to us regularly, like to teach it to us. So it kind of became like the secret language. So my mom and my auntie, when they'd be drinking tea and talking about some really juicy piece of gossip and all the cousins would come running in, when they immediately flipped into Italian, we knew like that was a good part. So our ears would perk up, but we wouldn't like totally understand what they were saying. I harangued my parents for years when I got older, like, how come you didn't talk to us? Because that's the easiest way, of course, to learn Italian. But what happened is I went on to take Spanish only because in school, because that was the closest thing to Italian. They didn't offer Italian in the 60s and 70s in school. And I am fluent in Spanish. So that really helps me a lot. So honestly, I have a lot of phrases and I can look up a sentence and I have it in my ear. Like when I went to Italy, I'd be listening and not totally understanding, maybe like 75% understanding, but I just would have this feeling like it wanted to come out of my body is the best way I can describe it. Like it was right there, but it's not there. So it's still on my list. I have to really learn the language, but I was being honest with you, Tom, because I could have said, oh yes, I love it so much. And I think it's in my early childhood ear. So I think I can, say a few sentences and kind of convince you. So thanks for saying that. You made me feel good.
You missed me.
And this is part of a manuscript. These poems I read to you is part of a manuscript. I like your idea of including the recipes. I hadn't thought of that, to tell you the truth, but at the moment it's just a poetry manuscript that has many of these stories about my family, but also a number of much more political work, honestly, about the current state of affairs with immigration and the border in this country, because they're all intimately connected for me. Right. So that's the manuscript I'm pretty much finishing right now and hope we'll have a publisher for in the near future.
A very different departure from your first book, and I haven't read your second yet, but I'm on the list to get that. Um, does anybody else have any more questions or comments before I ask something? It's fine. Well, yes,
Actually,
Judy.
I
Judy.
would like to mention that I read a very good book lately. It was called From Scratch. Tembi Locke, Locke. She was married to a Sicilian man. And in the story, you know, she's in Sicily a lot and meeting, and she happens to be African American, so she was not accepted, you know, right away by the parents, but she did get to know them. And she talks a lot about the food also, and all about and it's all, you know, a lot taking place in Sicily. So it might be of interest to you. From Scratch. Yeah.
Thank you. Great. I just
And
wrote it down.
Is your book available on Amazon or?
It is. So here's the plug part. Here, this is, I don't know if you can see that so well.
Gather the Night.
This is my not Zoom sophisticated way of doing it. But this is my first book of poetry called Gather the Night. That is many more memoir-like, not only, but memoir-like poems, and primarily concerned with my brother who was schizophrenic his entire life. And then the second book I have out is that just won that little award Carolyn mentioned, is We Are Meant to Carry Water. And this is a collaborative book that I wrote with two very, very dear friends, Tina Carlson and Stella Reed. And we wrote all of the poems together. And this is material that was inspired by the outcome of the 2016 presidential election, and has a stronger feminist voice being expressed within it.
So that's one of the things I was going to say, is your books are not like a series of the same thing repeated. It's very different topics, basically what moves you at the time. And your first book, I just want to say personally, was it was quite the healing journey for me to read that. Having had mental illness affecting a loved one, it was a very powerful experience. And I'm not a big poetry lover, but but
Well.
that no, I mean, I never, you know, I mean, I quote the Raven nevermore and blah blah blah, but something about your poetry really grabs me. It's not just about it's not about rhyming couplets, you know, it's about real juicy life things, and your choice of words and images I find very, very powerful. I think people have said that too, you know. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn.
Yeah, I mean, you heal a lot of people as being a nurse practitioner, and now as a writer, and with your food. I mean, I'm with April. I don't have that kind of background. I mean, when we had spinach, you know, I still saw the can line marks on my page, you know. So it's very lovely to be included in your family in that way.
Oh, well,
thank you.
Welcome in. Andiamo, Tom. My mom told me a story about their neighbor where they grew up in Fairview, New Jersey, a neighbor who was not Italian. And she hated spaghetti and spaghetti sauce, hated it her whole life, her neighbor, her childhood friend. And finally, one time my mom invited her over for her sauce, and she had it. And, you know, this look came over her eyes like, you know, this is not at all what my mom used to call spaghetti sauce. And the spaghetti sauce they grew up with was some kind of combination of like tomato soup and ketchup or something. A little, you know, the tomatoes got in there, but something very different than what my mom made and what we make. So that was, she had a convert there in her friend.
That's amazing. Anybody else? There's some things in the chat, mostly how wonderful you are, but
yeah. Thank you everyone. I was just looking at those messages too. Thank you so much all for your attendance and attention. It was great. It was really fun.